Hello, everyone, and welcome to Poets in Conversation. For June 2021, we are honored today to be hosting Donika Kelly and Diane Seuss, two Grey Wolf poets who have not met, which is so surprising to me because, as I mentioned a second ago, I feel like there should be like a Grey Wolf press camp every summer where all these luminaries get together. Welcome sincerely to Diane and Donika. How are you both today?
Oh, hanging in. It's a beautiful day. Can't really complain. I'm really excited for this conversation. So,
Yeah, I'm happy to be here and to finally meet such a master and two masters and to have this conversation. So thank you. I'm okay. It's storming, so, otherwise it's cool.
I love the idea that, Donika, you're in this really sort of beautiful, breezy place, and Diane, you've kicked up more of a storm, which maybe we'll get to as we continue. Well, I have to say, anybody who is not aware of your work from the last year has maybe been living under a rock, and yet so much has been going on the last year. For anyone who has been otherwise engaged, I want to go ahead and read your formal bios first, just briefly. So Donika Kelly, Donika, starting with you, Donika Kelly is the author of The Renunciations and Bestiary. Bestiary is the winner of the Cave Canem Poetry Prize, a Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Poetry, and the Kate Tufts Discovery Award, which is no joke, a finalist for a Publishing Triangle Award and a Lambda Literary Award, and it was longlisted for the National Book Award. And that was your first book, right? Which is a lot for a first book. That was doing a lot of work. A Cave Canem graduate fellow and member of the collective Poets at the End of the World, Donika has also received a Lannan Residency Fellowship and Summer Workshop Fellowship from the Fine Arts Work Center. She currently lives in Iowa City and is an assistant professor at the University of Iowa, where she teaches creative writing. So welcome, Donika.
thank you. Thank you.
Diane Seuss is the author of 4 previous collections: Still Life with 2 Dead Peacocks and a Girl. I'll just hold up the most recent ones before we get into the new ones. Still Life with 2 Dead Peacocks and a Girl, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and I feel often quoted for its great line, "All trees are trees, death to modifiers," which to me was one of the most exciting lines from the book. As well, Diane published Four-Legged Girl, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Wolf Lake, White Gown Blown Open, winner of the Juniper Prize, as well as It Blows You Hollow. And then, of course, we have her widely praised newest collection, Frank Sonnets, with what a great, great cover. Look, it's replicating itself, as it should. Diane served as writer-in-residence at Kalamazoo College for many years and is a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. Diane was raised by a single mother in rural Michigan, which she continues to call home. So thank you both for joining us from your various locations. I know when I reached out to both of you, I was especially interested in talking with you about your books in terms of the commentaries they offer on love. So there's so many different ways. Of course, love is such a prism, but so many different ways to think about it. But I've pulled some quotations from your poems to kind of get us started thinking about the books in these terms. So, Donika, in Bestiary, your poem Commandments, you have these lines that read, "Love is a religion, flesh is a religion, use the body like a drum." Diane, from Frank, you have lines that read, "Did you know the dead fall in love better than the living, 'cause nothing left to lose, the root of all blues." And a second one here, "Love came close anyway, found me out, its warped music all the rage." In both books, it seems like love is defined as something that evokes longing and hesitation and excitement and a lot of complexity. So I was just wondering if you could both talk for a second about both of your books, how they are new to you, and how you think of your own books in terms of this big question about love. Diane, do you want to start, if you don't mind?
No, sure, I will. Even though Frank deals with a lot of really complicated stuff and often dark things, I think it's a memoir in sonnets, so it's sort of a life story in a certain way. And I think its primary emotion is driven by love. And love, but not simply, and maybe not primarily romantic love, but love for my mother and my father, who died very young, for my son, who is a recovering drug addict, and Mikkel, who's on the cover of the book and who died, for the dead, often for the dead, and then a kind of movement towards self-love, and at least an exploration of that possibility, especially toward the end of the book. So love comes through, I mean, I think even in syntax, in music, in the lines. So even if the content of a poem is disturbing, there's love in the music of the language, and there's love for language.
Thank you. And how about you, Donika? Any thoughts on this?
Well, I just wanted to say, Diane, that definitely comes through, like that complexity and that movement towards self-love, but then also just the lushness in the language. Like I was reading to my beloved, I was like, listen to this one. Now listen to this one. And the poems just sound so good, feel so good, like in my mouth. And there's something just like really, like the care in that, really, really comes through. Some years ago, I was talking with Francine, my friend Francine, and we were talking about love and if you can love someone if you aren't in contact with them. And my response at the time was that I love my father. I don't like him. He's a terrible person, but I love him. So then what is the practice of loving someone who is an awful person? And for me, the practice of love meant not talking to him. Like that was how I practiced loving him, because to be in contact with him would mean that I cannot engage in loving behavior and what I understand is loving behavior. And I think that's one of the sort of underlying energies in the book, is like how to love in a way that feels loving, even if it doesn't look like the script for love. So in romantic relationships and in a parental relationship, what does it mean to say, oh, I need to stay back here, I still love you, I'm going to be careful in my language, I'm going to be careful with myself, I'm going to be careful with this relationship? But that actually means being detached. And I think that detachment, more so in this book, I think, than in Bestiary, allowed a deeper kind of inquiry and meditation on what it means to be connected and how to practice being in loving relationships in a healthy way, and to get myself closer to the center of my life, and for the speaker to get herself closer to the center of her life, which is, again, like really off script in the culture in which we live. So
Can I ask a question? I thought about that as I read your book, and I wondered how. So there are different mechanisms I felt like you used to have that distance when you needed it, and I wondered if you could talk about that a bit. For instance, myth, or even aesthetic madeness, this very closely made poem. I wondered if I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think mythology helped me elevate the sort of feelings, right? To sort of say, okay, now what if this very regular experience of having a difficult childhood were like mythological? What if it were like really big? And that created a different kind of distance than like poems where there are redactions or erasures, where the speaker, and I've it's been really great talking with people about my use of erasure, because I hadn't thought about it in this way, but before I started having the conversations, but I'm giving my speaker space to not have to say something that would be really harmful to say, right? Like to just like say, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to write it because it would be really hard to write. but then also the speaker doesn't have to say it. And that creates a little bit of distance from the feeling, or sort of modulates the speaker's relationship to the feeling. And that, like the mechanics of that were intuitive, but it's been really great to be able to talk a little bit about that now and to think about, oh wait, how is this actually working? I think it was like self-preservation most of the time. But I think the result of that self-preservation is, oh, I don't have to say everything, you know.
And that's what you have to do for yourself, for self-preservation, becomes part of the aesthetic that you're enacting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I noticed and I really admire in this book.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's often, in addition to redactions, there's restraint and hesitation. And I would say I would associate this especially with your books, Donika. Whereas in Diane, in yours, I feel like sometimes the balm, it's not necessarily a balm, but the chiming of rhymes, and almost at times the cluttered nature of the sonnets pushing up against the edge of the page, they create this sense of order within often something that's being described in terms of disorder. And so I wondered if we could stick on this for just one more point. In one of your sonnets, Diane, you used the line, "I could do the love, but I couldn't do the pyre," Pyre. I couldn't do the pyre. And it got me thinking about both of your books, which I feel like the speakers, various speakers and a primary speaker, seems to seek the possibility of achieving love and seeking out love and stuff. So I wondered if in your poems or in your books, you feel like love without loss is possible in poetry, maybe in life. I don't mean to make you be philosophers for all of our lives, but what do you think about that idea about love with loss being possible, love without loss being possible? And I'll just disclose myself. I find it much easier to write poems about loss and heartbreak than I do to write poems about really functional, like steady, positive experiences. And so I mean this both in terms of life, but also in terms of crafting a poem that has an arc.
Oh.
All right. I mean, I think it's possible. I really enjoy writing love poems. It's one of my favorite things to write, just like full stop. And I write lots of poems for my beloved that are very deep in the feeling. And it's usually when we're apart. That's the only, it's like she's somewhere else. Like I'm in one place and she's somewhere else. And so there's a tiny bit of loss, right? There's something across which the love is like reaching, right? But it's not, the pyre. But I think I think about Anne Carson and Eros the Bittersweet, which was really helpful for me in thinking about the dynamic in a love poem, or even in writing about love. That triangulation is really helpful to create a kind of sense of tension or investment on the part of the reader, and even on the part of the speaker. Like there's something, even if it's a functional, something has to be sort of reaching across. But even without it being like healthy or functional, I guess I want to say something along the lines of, and maybe this goes back to what Diane was saying earlier. I love myself. My speaker loves herself, right? And so whatever out of whatever space the poems are emerging, there is a sort of sense of love and safety that is being generated, like on site, right? Like at the site of creating the poem. And that is a much better space I have learned to write out of. It's maybe not as like high flying, but it feels better. It feels like more sustainable. Diane, you're nodding. You have that experience as well?
I have to unmute here. This is a big question for me, because, I mean, my very personality was developed around the loss of one of my parents when I was 7. And so my sort of the shape of love in me includes loss. It's almost impossible for me not to think of it that way. And the intensities of my various relationships have all needed to come to a close in order for me to sort of find my way back to myself. So I would say for some people that is a possibility. It's not the thing that I think about as a writer. It's not the problem that I entertain in my work. Because I think poetry for me,
I think maybe the storm might have cut into Diane for a second. So maybe while we wait for her to come back, I will ask Donika. Oh, wait, maybe she's coming back. We'll see.
Hello?
Oh, yay. Oh, yes. Good. You're back.
Yeah. Everybody was gone there.
Sorry, it froze for a second. You were saying that that's not the particular problem that is primarily at issue in your work, the problem of love being linked to loss.
Right. And I'll just quickly say that I know, that I love Donika's love poems, and they're not without complexity. They're not simple, and they don't sort of push away the possibility of loss, even if it's not addressed. But my work is pretty much formed around, the reason that I ever wanted to write poems was language as a bridge to the dead. And so loss is part of the configuration. It's just how I roll.
Diane, that made me think about, like, that makes so much sense to me. And I was thinking about, like, what brought me to poetry and to writing, which I did not like. I did not like writing. I was like, this is ridiculous. Why would anybody do this? But it was the experience that I had of, like, childhood sexual abuse removed me from myself. Like, I lost myself, right? And I think the poems were a way of acknowledging that, like, something was lost and I didn't know how to get it back, and it's taken like 20 years to, like, figure out, oh, right, I'm here. So I feel like I'm super grateful that, like, now it's on site. Love, I got it. Like, I love me, I'm safe. But for a long period of time, that was not the case. And I think that that's also sort of a parallel energy in the work. And yeah, what you said, just, I was like, oh yeah, that's like a really big component as well. So.
I was wondering, Donika, if you might be willing, this would be, it seems, a good time for you, if you would, to read one of your love poems, titled Love Poem, as several are, from the Renunciations. This is page 15 for anyone who might be following along. I think it probably evokes some of the points that Diane was making too. I'm also thinking about how the act of writing, especially as women, the act of writing and claiming space and offering one's voice feels like an act of self-love. Like, I deserve enough to take up some space, to be on the page. It feels kind of radical in that way, at least to me. So Donika, I don't know if you want to set the poem up at all, but if you wouldn't mind.
I do, because it's a poem that, so I wrote it for my now ex-wife, and I loved writing her love poems as well. I was like, oh, I got this love poem, write this love poem. And she took such issue with the poem. She was like, I am not the ocean. I am not this big thing. She's like, I'm just a person. And that began to sort of like highlight one of the dynamics in the relationship. But this poem was written before I understood that. So, love poem. Let us be ocean and coast, a taking into and over one another, shifting sediment, a breaking down of rock, dredge, and deposit. a series of prepositions meaning proximity, although the most of us extends away from one another. Once in winter, I ventured far inland, forgot the crash of gravity pulling you over me and away, forgot there is a place where we meet and retreat but never let go. Let this be a moment of remembering my love as I stand at the edge of myself, cliff and seagrass and the screaming gull above, sighting your breath to the horizon.
It's gorgeous. I noticed, I don't know if it's, and Diane, I want to get your reaction in a second. I just, if you don't mind, I'll frame it. I noticed that with both of you, I don't know that it's the world's biggest coincidence because a lot of people use natural imagery in talking about love, but I pulled some lines from both of your books where you use natural images to describe intimacy, and in fact, specifically images of water meeting land. So Donika, I am a river against you in one poem, and then of course, let us be ocean and coast, a taking into and over one another. Diane, from yours, how the ocean and continent are essentially love on a terrible mission to meet up with itself, how even with the surface roiling, the depths are calmly nursing away at love. So it really struck me that you both had this idea of a negotiation of shoreline as being somehow akin to love and relationships. Diane, it seemed like maybe you had a reaction to Donika's poem, so let me pass it to you.
I wonder, is that one of the 14-line poems? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So were you sonneting?
Wait, let me see. This one isn't.
Oh.
It's a 15-line poem.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. There are some sonnets in here, like some 14, doing some 14 lines.
Yeah.
It feels so helpful with the love poems, you know, like just to have that container, right? To know that was settled, which I think you've talked a little bit about as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that sort of the ocean and the shore, they're not my landscape, but when I started this book, I was on the West Coast in Washington State at a residency. And so I was receiving that landscape in a really fresh way. And I think it pulled those opening poems, and especially maybe that one that you quoted, pulled them out of me like tide almost. And I found myself making use of those details, you know, turning detail into image, into metaphor that I wouldn't have normally had access to because my landscape is Midwest. What is your landscape, Donika?
Well, it's a mix. I was born in LA, lived there until I was 13. So kind of like it's not very natural, the part of LA I lived in. I was in Compton. So like we had trees in the backyard, but there wasn't a lot of like good green space. But we went to the beach a lot. And then when I was 13, we moved to Arkansas. And southern Arkansas is very piney, lots of pine. And I loved it. I loved being there too. But I wrote that poem, the one that I read after I'd moved back to California. And it was just like being back in the state. I was like, right, oceans, which I, you know, like there's something just like really calming about them. Like they center me in my smallness. They reassure me of my smallness, and the water does. And there's something about that land and water are different, and and the boundary between them is not permeable. One is going to wear away at the other, right? And that dynamic feels compelling. I think that's one that I come back to a lot, just sort of thinking about, you know, and then there's like climate change and that kind of thing. And it feels like really much more pressing. In Iowa, there is that sort of vastness as well. It's just different. Yeah. It's just the land and the wind. So much wind.
The spaciousness. I love that landscape.
It's beautiful.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
That space between the ocean and the land, my mentor, who's not with us anymore, but he did a poem and called it the slurry, and I didn't know that word. So it's that stuff, that foam and roughed up sand between the two. I think that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, a broader question spinning off of this has to do with metaphor. I know we mentioned it earlier. I mean, I'm switching gears a little bit into a craft question, especially for the poets who are watching and myself selfishly. But I wanted to ask a little bit about how both of you at times kind of push back on metaphor. Of course, you use metaphor extensively, and metaphor way more than like simile or something. But Diane, I mentioned before what I consider your famous line from Still Life, all trees are trees, death to modifiers. And Donika, I found in Ars Empathica, in yours, but about the tree, no euphemism there. A tree fell. And it struck me that in both cases, there seemed to be an argument for metaphor at times being helpful and appropriate in leading us toward some sort of truth, emotional truth, or just a faithful rendering of what is, and the risk of metaphors potentially obscuring ideas or obscuring just even the image itself by being overly ornamented, distracting us from the profound plainness of something. So I wondered, especially for the poets who are watching, if you guys could talk a little bit about metaphors and when you find yourself, if at all, pushing back on them and welcoming them. They can definitely get too ornamented at times, huh? You want to start, Donika, this time?
I was trying to find a poem where Diane writes about the tree. In like there's a tree, but it's my tree, but it's not my tree.
Oh yeah, I have that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love
It's
like whenever I
from
love
this
that
bench. I like to call my bench.
Yeah.
It begins. Yeah.
And sort of like that negotiation of possession, but it's not actually possession, or I don't know. Like there's something really in that poem that gets me. Solmaz Sharif, I think is against metaphor correctly. I want to say, whenever I hear Solmaz talk about metaphor, I think she probably has it right. I sometimes hide in it. I think, especially with the Greek mythology, it feels like a way of elevating something that's really ordinary, and it's useful to a degree, but it's also it hides the ordinariness of it. And so I think the pushing back when that happens in other poems, it's like, no, I need to be present. I need to be here. I need to be apprehending what is in front of me. Like that has actually become a very important practice of just like being able to describe things without a lot of ornamentation. I have a student who just graduated, so brilliant at description. And he came to me, he was like, I'm so sorry, these poems don't really have metaphors. I was like, David, hush, shut up. These are amazing. Like, let's get into what you are doing. That is just like, the descriptions are so fine. To be able to attend to something as it is, I mean, language is already turning things into metaphor anyway, like it's already transforming the thing into language. So, but I think that just being aware of the dangers of obfuscation, right? The dangers of hiding inside of an image. Being aware of that is really helpful in writing, I think. Doesn't mean that we can't do it, shouldn't do it. There are no shoulds and shoulds here, but shoulds or should nots, but it's helpful to be aware. I have found in my own writing. Like, and again, like my partner pointing, like my ex-wife saying, no, I am not an ocean. You are not the shore. And I was like, right. We're just two people.
Yes, people. I am. I'm the shore. No, you're not. You're the ocean.
Yeah. Just like who gets to be what? Yeah.
Stanley Plumley has a great essay called Autobiography and Archetype, in which he talks about how our stories, our individual stories, are invigorated and made accessible and larger as by archetype, like what you do with myth, and that the myths, old as time, are renewed by our individual stories. So I think that that's certainly, I think that's really working in this book. I've been reading a lot of Gerard Manley Hopkins lately, and his terrible sonnets, and looking at sort of the trajectory of his writing life. And I was reading that he went through this change in which nature, with a capital N, which was kind of the romantics version of nature, became small n nature. So he was using the natural world less as kind of emblematic, symbolic, metaphorical than detail, than seeing the particular tree, stone, whatever, and finding meaning there in those particulars. So I'm interested in that, and I'm feeling now, so-called post-pandemic Trumpian world, that it is those details that I have to turn to find my way back or somewhere. My yard, just small things. But, we can't just kind of, well, we can, but it's not going to do it for long to just list what we see. So I think we're always putting pressure on what we see to find correspondence with something within us. I think in Frank, there's less metaphor than in previous books. And now I'm experimenting with longer poems and with sort of going all out. I'm even using similes. I'm doing like and just what would happen if I did that. So I like, my whole writing life has been characterized by, okay, I did that. Now how about this? And what will that allow me to tell that I haven't yet?
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about lowercase in nature in terms of kinship, right? That we're in the space. I'm in the space together with the chipmunks in the backyard and the deer walking through the backyard and the whale out there. That there's a kinship in our experience that doesn't elevate the human over everything else, right? But sort of just trying. I feel like that thinking is useful to sort of scale it to scale it down. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm moving. I feel like definitely I'm moving towards that. But I think what you're saying too, Diane, about just describing what we see isn't enough, or describing what we apprehend isn't enough, right? And so there's something with juxtaposition that feels really helpful, putting things near each other and seeing what the resonance is there, that can be really exciting. And I feel I've learned that from other poets. But also the student, David. Anyway, it's just, it's exciting to see. So.
David's getting a serious shout out on this. I hope he's watching.
He's not watching, but if he was,
we'll have to send it to him. Well, it's funny, Donika, you were saying that. I was thinking the same thing. And Diane, maybe you'd be up for reading us one of the poems. I know you and I had talked about a few, or maybe you have some in mind, but I wanted to say, if we lean on metaphor as being about making the unfamiliar familiar and the familiar unfamiliar, it seems like in Frank, a lot of that is done by, as Donika was just saying, association and kind of proximity. So there's often things that are sort of unlikely associations, which I think are the most delicious thing in any poem. Like when you have a poem about planting seeds and all of a sudden there's a thread and a bobbin, in the next line, just these unexpected associations, they tell us so much about the Rolodex of ideas and experiences of the speaker and the poet. And for me, function in that way, in a similar way to metaphor, but not with less self-consciousness, essentially. So Diane, I didn't know if maybe there was a poem that you would be up for reading for us, just so we could see this in action. And then I want to remind everyone who's watching to please, I know people are already putting questions in the comments, but pretty soon we'll move into Q&A. So please feel free to drop questions and comments in the comment box.
Do you have one that you particularly wanted me to read, or?
Oh, well, yes. There were, I had a few different ones that I had marked. Let's see, if you have your book out, and if other people have their book out, page 18 is one that I thought was really amazing. People might like to hear. Of course,
how does that begin?
Page 18 begins, there's a certain state of grace. There's also page 98, which is literature is dangerous. I thought would be a great one. I don't know if either of those strike you.
I took out, I have the ones that you were interested in. What would you think of I should have been in cinema?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay. I just want to say beforehand that one thing I love about the sonnet is that it's so compressed that within those 14 lines, it almost requires you take big leaps through time and space. Okay. I should have been in cinema. I should have been in paint or founded a band. I am certain of nothing, said the tattoo. Where is home? Scratched the chickens. I should have met the stones when I had the chance. Should have let Keith turn me inside out. So what if I ended up dead or crazy? I am big, but this feeling is bigger, the silo whispered. I am a movie screen, drawled the pasture. I should have kept the baby. So what, poverty? I could have loved the little fox-faced punk. I am buxom, breathed the prairie. I should have taken the radical path. I should have gone the cheerleader's way. Should have married Chuck before he enlisted. What if I'm a star, said the lamb. A star, said the ham. A star, said the duck. A star, said the truck. A star, said the star. Is this music about sound and not notes? What if it broadcasts a shimmering? I think that's one of the weirdest poems in the book. Because the leaps, there are several speakers in a 14-line poem. I mean, there's kind of a speaker looking back on her shoulda, coulda, woulda, right? And then there's the, and a lot of it about the city. And then there's the rural place and objects within that space speaking. And at the end, you know, it's the lamb and the ham and the star, and the speaker has kind of either melded into those things or gone away. So, you know, that's an instance where, no, I'm not sort of constructing a seamless narrative, but there's a conversation going on that, so it's a narrative that doesn't rely on metaphor. It relies on dialogue. Yeah.
But then, as you said, at that point in the book, I feel like the book has taught us to read that poem. It's one of the ones I had marked too, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
It's
That's why I read it.
One of my favorites too. I love that one. But I feel like by the end, I'm funneling personas from the book into that poem and reading them through that poem. So it feels like a little bit of a decoder, you know, like a little dragonfly eye kind of thing. Well, you brought up in that poem, we get a reference to music as we get throughout the book. There's one other question I wanted to pose to both of you, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. I see there are many. And thank you again both for being here. This is really great. So Diane and Frank, your poem on page 59, you make a reference to noise unmediated by music. Noise unmediated by music. And I thought this was very interesting for poets because I wondered for both of you, how does one, either as a person or a poet or however you want to think about it, distinguish between noise unmediated by music, and the music within noise.
Mm.
So how do you separate noise unmediated by music and the music within noise, or are you listening for something else? Maybe you're not even listening for kind of music and order in that way. Diane, since you're writing in a sonnet form, and since you write so often about music, maybe we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Oh, goody. Um,
Tell us all the answers, please.
oh God, honey. So I was interested in music in this book. Obviously because traditional sonnets are kind of made that way. And I didn't always leap to rhyme, but sometimes I really did. But I also wanted to sort of talk about music, sort of as a cultural critic sometimes, or as a mechanism for intimacy. And so I think sometimes some poems require noise, and sometimes some poems require music. You know, it's that raw versus cooked thing. And sometimes I love making poems that are really cooked and made beautifully and use music constructively. And then sometimes I want to write raw and I want to make noise. So it depends on the feeling. Yeah. Your turn.
I love that so much. I love it. Like some poems need music, some poems need noise. Ah, so good. What do I want to say? I love music, but I'm no good.
Yes, you are.
Well, and so, but I was thinking when I was starting to write the poems that would end up in this book, I wanted them to be very clear. Like I wanted them to be very open. I wanted people to know what was going on. I just like wanted to try to just like be clear, to be accessible, to just like invite people into the space. And the challenge was, how do you do that? At least for me, I was like, how do I do that and there still be music? Like I don't know. I mean, I think I figured it out. But I remember I was in a class with Gabby Cavalcaresi, who was teaching the class. I was in a little summer workshop like 4 years ago. It was great. So fun to just like be in someone else's class and not have to do anything but like write poems. And I explained that was the issue that I was having in the poems that I was writing. I wanted the poems to be clear, but to have music. And I said, the moon rose over the bay. I had a lot of feelings. That's not a poem. But I was like, that's a great title. So I'm gonna use that title like 5 times. And it's like, what comes under that, right? Like, what is the feeling that comes under that title? And I don't know. I think the other thing I was thinking about is just like the way that my family talks. It's like I love the way my family talks. I love the way we talk. Like when I'm with my family, the way like sounds bend, vowels get very wavy. My grandpa says this thing. He says, we all remembered this. He was fixing something. He said, wrench around and wrench it off. And we were like, what? We were like, well, what are you saying? And he was saying, reach around and rinse it off. And I was like, but you said wrench twice. There's no rinse or reach in that. But there was. And there was just something about just like, I've really been lately leaning into the sounds of my family, which are just like so pleasing and so beautiful, for the music. Like,
I'm so glad you said that, because that's the kind of music that sort of high level academic poetry has not sanctioned or opened the door to. Mm-hmm. But yes, I mean, and that's a music that contains wisdom too. Mm-hmm. Or joke, which is another kind of wisdom. Mm-hmm. And in Peacocks, my last book, one of the sonnet, there it is. One of the sonnets that are written about still life paintings ends, art useless as tits on a boar. And that came from my mother. she used to say, oh, Frank, he was useless as tits on a boar. And, and, maybe we both were raised in families where language was one of the legacies, we didn't inherit a lot, but we got that.
Yeah.
And the playfulness, the sounds, the roundness, the nuance. And yes, that's the music.
Yes. Such good music.
I think sometimes you have to fight for it too, don't you? I mean,
Yeah.
so like last summer or last fall, I think it was, even mid-pandemic, I was lucky enough to be recording my book, like an audio version. And the audio engineer stopped me at the end of one poem, and the end of the poem said something about something blah, 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 blah. When I look away as longing as lure, like a fish lure. And I said, as longing as lure. And he said, no, it's not lure, it's lure. And so he asked me to do it 2 more times. And my inside self complied first. And then I heard it and I said, we got to go back. Like, no one I know will understand that. It doesn't sound like me, and it's not the place of what I'm talking about. It's lure. It's not lure.
Right.
Where are you from?
Central Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
Central Pennsylvania, yeah. And, but yeah, regional music is one of the things to celebrate too. And I always get sad when I get new students and I can't tell where they're from. So we have so many questions from the audience. I want to turn it over to them if you don't mind. And I thought we could start maybe with this great question from Mandana about the collections themselves. It's a long one, so let me put it across here. A collection is greater than the sum of its parts. So with distance, especially now that these deeply personal works are in the world and shaped by others' gazes, how do you reflect on them? Do they feel different to you now? That's a great question from Mandana. Thanks. Everybody got that one? So with distance and perspective, Donika, you want to start with that one?
Yeah. I think my poems are better together, is my sense. Like, I think they work well together. They get bigger together. They get louder together. So I'm so pleased with the book, as a book, as an ordered thing. I got a lot of help from Jeff Schatz on that. He was like, please give us some space. I said, no. He said, give us some space. I said, no. He said, please. I said, fine.
Oh, I would have loved to have been a mouse in the corner.
He said, please give us some breathing room. I said, okay. But I was really anxious before the book came out. And I realized I was having feelings that weren't about the book as a piece of art, as a thing that I made. I was having feelings about the experiences that I'd written about. And when I was able to separate that out, I was like, oh, this book is very enjoyable to me. I mean, it's a hard book. It's not an easy book, but I feel really grateful to have had the opportunity to put together a second collection that I feel so excited about, with some poems that I just really, really love. So it's been great, I guess, is the answer to that question. I just, I like putting a book together, not writing a book, because that's a different thing, but taking the poems and saying, okay, what's the order here? What's the shape here? How can I direct the reader through these experiences? It's very pleasing.
Your book has a really impeccable trajectory too. And, I really loved thinking about how it was put together. And I was imagining Jeff in that equation, what did he provide in terms of pushback? Because I get that from him too, and it's really helpful. I'm just grateful as hell. Yeah, when I think about Frank, writing it was such a personal, solitary experience. And since it's gone into the world, people talk about it, and people have feelings about it, and have felt permitted to do certain kinds of writing because of it. And that all feels really good. It doesn't impact I don't know how to say it. You know, that's a different part of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very, I'm very grateful for that. As a book, it's still kind of hard for me to look at the whole thing and to see it all in place. Sometimes it's hard for me. Like even when I get a check, like money, I sort of don't look at it for a long time.
Because what is money? I do the same thing. I'm just like, I don't know what this is.
Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing or something. But I mean, this feels like such a collaborative piece in a lot of ways, with my friend on the front and permission from certain friends to provide dialogue or lines that I use. My son's interaction in the middle of the book, you know, his permission and our conversations. So in that sense, it doesn't feel sort of like toot your horn, Di. You know, it's a collaboration between all the people that I've loved and me, you know, and poetry, wherever that comes from. And Frank O'Hara, you know, who taught me by example spontaneity in language.
It also feels a little bit like an alternative history, you know? Like there's something that's been put in the record on behalf of many people, and yet specifically in your book, Diane, the speaker often subverts her own authority in that way, like enough with you, queen, you know, that kind of thing. Like there's ways in which like it's elevated and then dismantled at the same time, which is really interesting.
Well, yeah, that's good.
Sorry, we have another question here, and Donika, I thought maybe you could take this one first because it's specifically about erasure poems. Deborah Bennett asks, I'm curious about the mechanics of erasure.
I would like to know more about that question. I mean, I on my end, you know, the first thing I did was to use black highlighter, just like the black highlighter in Word. Like that was what I used for the poems that are redacted. And then where there is like poems where there is erasure, they're bracketed. And I had a conversation with Jeff and Chance Erlin in doing like the copy edits for the book. And they asked if the brackets should be italicized in the way that the dialogue had been italicized. And I said, no. And I didn't even know I had a feeling about it until they asked. And I was like, no, something's been taken out. And it was important that the lines be vertical to sort of indicate the incision that had been made, or and that was strange to have such a strong feeling about that. But the other thing, I think, artistically, I was thinking about withholding from the reader, because the poems are really personal. I think there is an impulse on the part of readers to say, I know you, after reading poems that are as personal as the ones that I've written. And I wanted to point out that there is a lot that's been left out. Things have been taken out. It is not the complete picture. And in fact, no one wants the whole thing, because as I said before, it's boring. Like, who wants the whole thing? So that's how I think about erasure and redaction, and sort of as a means of withholding. So what do you think, Diane?
I haven't done erasure, but in your book, I experienced it as you're describing it, and also in a way as that you were kind of protecting me, and you know, keeping stuff personal that's nobody's business, but also I felt your gentleness.
Thank you. I really do just like want to run away, like right now. I'm like, I'm seen. Let me go hide.
It's also interesting that that reaction comes mainly from Diane's just brilliance, but also partly from a conversation about the parts that were left out or the parts that were implied. I was thinking about both of you as these sort of expert craftspeople in terms of like the blank space and you know how you're able to engineer the spaces between stanzas and between lines and within the brackets. To me, the unitalicized brackets, which I never would have thought of, so shout out to Jeff Schatz, but the unitalicized brackets, they're a reminder that this is the person's action, not just a neutral record of speech. But we have one final question that I think actually wraps up some of these things that we've brought up really well. This comes from Laura Tanner. Laura Tanner, who asks, Diane referred to pushing against the narrow notions of music in high-level academic poetry. How do you both conceive of your audience? Does the consciousness of audience shape the way you write? I think that's a really interesting question to end on because it ties in so many of the things we've talked about. And I will just, if you don't mind, send out one flare here, which is both books I had marked about how often they establish their conversational bases. Donika Bestiary, which I've been calling bestiary, so sorry about that. Bestiary begins with imperatives and the second person, and the final poem uses declarative sentences and a we. We lived in the imperative, so on and so forth. Diane, of course, you have active dialogue, actual dialogue, quotations, direct address. So could you talk to us a little bit? I'll just put Laura's question across one more time about how you conceive of your audience and the consciousness of audience. Great question to end on. So thanks, Laura.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think like many writers, I don't think too much about audience as I'm generating, but as I revise, I do. And when I've been working on an essay about hope and poetry, and that you have to have a degree of hope to have the will to make a poem. And part of that is that I think you have to have a sense that there will be someone to receive it. And I'm not real picky about who that is, but I'd like to think that most of my work could be received by people where I'm from, and that people don't have to be studied sort of to receive these poems. But I also do want them to appeal. You know, I'd like my work to appeal to people who are literary. I'm not against the literary at all. Mm-hmm. I love it. It's held me up. So, and then I also, maybe this is the answer, that I feel like in so many ways, Kevin Young has a great essay called Deadism, in which he talks about, you know, writing for the dead, writing to the dead, writing from the dead. And I would say that is my primary audience.
I think I'll echo a lot of what you said. I mean, in generating new work, I'm writing for my own pleasure almost the whole time. And if it seems like the poem is something that I want to share, then I think, okay, how can I have it do the thing that I want it to do? And as I've mentioned more recently, I've been reaching towards a kind of clarity. So my sister read the book and she really liked it, which was great. My sister is not like a big reader, but and the day the book came out, I was telling her I was nervous, and she said, it's hot and ready, like a Little Caesar's pizza. And I was like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, this is what I want, like hot and ready, like a pizza. There was like no greater compliment to me than that.
No, that's awesome.
It was so good. I was like, see, we're gifted. We're out here making images.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, I want my poems to meet my own internal standard of excellence, which I think is pretty high. Like what, you know, and I have like a very particular aesthetic. But I also want people to feel invited in. Because the poems that kept me writing poetry were the ones where I felt invited in and I knew what was happening, but there was still music and there was craft and there was all the stuff that I love. And I think it's actually super hard to do. I think it's hard to bring people into a space and say, I got you. So, so that's how I think about audience late. But audience does matter, you know?
My sister watches almost all of these things I do. So she may be watching now. I hope so. She's going through very difficult health crisis this last couple of years. And her husband is a Vietnam vet, from a very small town. They watch every single thing and they love it. It's brought them something. So I hope she's watching our sisters and the Little Caesars. I mean, she was a hospice nurse. She has a ferocity that I can't even approach. So I want to write what she cares about.
Seems like so often a question about like access or like who can access a certain poem really has to do with the poem being read live too, you know? So just a final shout out for live readings and people going to live readings like Shakespeare, who can really understand it when you sit there and just read it alone in a room, but going to see it staged somewhere, at least it makes some sense, and then you can judge it however you want. So, well, I can't thank you both enough. This has been such a lovely conversation and such a great peek, not only into the work and the products of your labors, but also into the processes that you use to produce them. It's also lovely to think of you guys now as collaborators, maybe working with each other. We need like a hybrid, some sort of epistolary book of poems or something now. I want to remind everyone watching that A Mighty Blaze is a volunteer organization that tries to connect writers to readers in the pandemic and now beyond. So if you're interested in what we're doing and you'd like to see notifications about more events, you can follow Mighty Blaze on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to be notified, learn about the organization, so on and so forth. A sincere thank you again to Diane Seuss and Donika Kelly, with a hat tip to Grey Wolf for lending us two of their sort of prize members, and a vote again for Grey Wolf Summer Camp.
Allison, you're a brilliant host and interviewer. Thank you.
These are wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
That's very nice of you. My trick is inviting people who are geniuses, literally. Just doing nothing. So there, mission accomplished. I would like to remind everyone about your beautiful books. And please, I've been reading them, rereading them. My 9-year-old daughter has been reading them and picking them up. So people of all ages can appreciate. I want to thank you again and remind everyone to check out A Mighty Blaze if you'd like to watch this conversation again or if you'd like to learn more about the organization. Thank you again to Diane and Donika.
Thank you.
Thank you.